Sparks rained down as my blowtorch fused the composite plating directly over her heart. She was a Vorani warlord, 7 feet of lethal muscle, and we were surrounded. She leaned into the shower of sparks, her eyes locking onto mine. "Go on, human," she whispered. "Show them why we bleed." The air in Outpost Jericho tasted like battery acid and pulverized concrete. We were a joint mercenary detail, human engineers and Vorani shock troopers, contracted by Caterpillar Off-World to protect the Helium-3 refineries on Kepler-186F. It was supposed to be a standard deterrent job, but the local separatist faction didn't care about standard, and they certainly didn't care about our contracts. They had been shelling our position for 3 days straight. I was Caleb Wyatt, a former structural welder from Detroit, who had traded building Boeing Starliners for patching up mercenary armor in the mud. My hands were calloused, permanently stained with carbon grease, and currently shaking as the artillery concussions rattled the subterranean engineering bay. The heavy blast doors hissed open, breaking the rhythmic thud of the bombardment. Commander Kendra stepped through the smoke. That wasn't her birth name, of course. Vorani vocalizations sounded like grinding tectonic plates, so she had adopted a human name when she took command of the Joint Task Force. She was a towering figure, over 7 feet of dense, ash-gray muscle, her skin interwoven with natural dermal ridges. But right now, she was leaning heavily against the bulkhead, leaving a smear of glowing, violet-hued blood against the steel. Her combat rig, a heavily modified Lockheed Martin exoskeleton meant to withstand direct plasma fire, was shredded. The chest plate, specifically the section guarding her primary heart, was peeled back like a tin can hit by a sledgehammer. "Wyatt," she rasped, her voice a deep, resonant rumble that vibrated in my chest. "The line is breaking. I need this sealed. Now." "Jesus, Commander," I muttered, grabbing my medical kit and a heavy-duty plasma torch. "You're leaking everywhere. Sit down before you bleed out on my deck." She didn't argue, which told me exactly how much pain she was in. She collapsed onto a reinforced titanium crate, her breathing ragged. Vorani were proud, almost to a fault. For her to come to a human grease monkey instead of her own medical cast meant things outside were desperate. "I don't need a medic," Kendra grunted, swatting away the biofoam canister I offered. "The flesh will knit, the armor will not. If my chest plate is open, the next sniper round will core me. Fix the steel, human." I grabbed my diagnostic scanner and knelt between her boots, pulling the heavy welding visor over my face. As I closely examined the damage, my stomach dropped. "Hold still," I said, my voice tightening. I used a pair of hydraulic calipers to pry the jagged edges of the carbon-tungsten alloy apart. The deeper I looked into the blast crater on her chest plate, the less sense it made. Plasma fire from the separatists burned wet and messy, leaving a scorched, melted ring. But this? The edges of the breach were razor-sharp, folded perfectly inward. The microservos connecting the inner lining were sheared with geometric precision. "Commander," I said slowly, tracing the lip of the metal with a gloved finger. "What exactly hit you?" "An artillery shell airburst," she coughed, her violet blood sizzling faintly as it hit the hot floor grating. "Shrapnel caught me on the western ridge. Why?" I lowered my visor and looked up into her slitted amber eyes. "Because this isn't shrapnel damage. Shrapnel is chaotic. This is an explosive blowout." But the blast didn't come from the outside. Kendra went rigid, her massive hands gripping the edges of the titanium crate so hard the metal groaned. "Explain." I pointed the tip of my caliper at a microscopic, scorched mechanism wedged deep between the synthetic muscle fibers of her suit. You see this gray ash? That's RDX polymer residue. It's a shaped microcharge. Someone planted a breaching explosive inside your armor, right over your primary heart, and triggered it remotely. The only reason you aren't dead is because Vorane bone density is twice what standard human munitions are calculated for. Silence hung in the engineering bay, heavier than the dust in the air. I was mending her chest armor, hands hovering over the exposed, beating rhythm of her chest, when she suddenly leaned closer. The heat radiating off her skin was intense, smelling of copper and ozone. "Go on, human," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, silken purr. "Tell me who is trying to kill me." I swallowed hard. The RDX signature. That's not separatist tech. That's corporate. Standard issue for our human auxiliary units. Whoever blew your armor, they're inside the wire. Her amber eyes narrowed to feral slits. Director Mitchell. Mitchell was the corporate overseer for the colony, a slick operator from Rio Tinto Interstellar who had been constantly clashing with Kendra over defensive strategies. He wanted to abandon the refineries and secure the extraction ships. Kendra had refused to leave the human civilian workers behind. If Mitchell took out the Vorane command structure, I reasoned, my mind racing as I grabbed a fresh sheet of hardened tungsten, he could declare a tactical retreat, abandon the civilians, and cut Rio Tinto's financial losses. "And my people are dying on the ridge, believing the enemy is in front of them," Kendra snarled, attempting to stand. "Whoa, hey, sit down." I shoved a hand against her uninjured shoulder. It was like pushing a brick wall, but she stopped. "If you go out there with a hole in your chest, Mitchell's snipers will finish the job. Give me 3 minutes." I cranked the plasma torch to its maximum setting. I didn't have time for a clean, factory-grade weld. I slapped the raw tungsten plate over the gaping hole in her chest, the metal resting mere inches from her exposed skin. "This is going to burn," I warned. "Do it," she commanded, not even flinching. I ignited the torch. White-hot plasma bit into the metal, fusing the tungsten to the remnants of her rig. Sparks cascaded like a waterfall over her shoulders and lap, illuminating the dark bay in violent, flashing bursts. She didn't scream, though I heard her massive teeth grinding together as the heat radiated into her chest. Humans have a reputation among the stars for being soft, squishy creatures. But the Vorane had quickly learned that what we lacked in natural armor, we made up for in our terrifying willingness to harness raw destruction to survive. "Done," I barked, killing the torch and spraying a burst of rapid cooling aerosol over the glowing weld. Before the steam could even clear, the heavy blast doors to the engineering bay chimed. A red override light flashed on the control panel. Someone had just locked us in. "Wyatt!" Kendra's voice was eerily calm as she stood up. The newly welded tungsten plate on her chest hissing softly. "Step behind me." I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed a heavy hyperspanner from my workbench and backed toward the rear egress hatch. The main comms terminal on my desk crackled to life, routing a localized audio feed. Director Mitchell's voice filtered through the static, smooth and dripping with false regret. "Commander Kendra, I see your biomonitors are still active. I must admit, the durability of the Vorane physiology is truly something for the medical journals. A shaped charge to the chest should have pulverized your heart." "Mitchell," Kendra growled, drawing a massive kinetic hand cannon from her thigh holster. "When I get through this door, I am going to rip your spine out through your throat." "I'm afraid that won't be possible," Mitchell sighed. "The Separatists have breached Sector 4. It is a tragic loss. Commander Kendra, overwhelmed by enemy fire, fought valiantly to the end. Rio Tinto Interstellar will ensure your family receives full compensation. Oh, and Wyatt, I'm sorry you were in the room. Just bad timing, son." The comms clicked off. Instantly, the air vents along the ceiling hissed, pumping in a thick, yellowish gas. "Chlorine trifluoride," I yelled, recognizing the acrid, metallic smell immediately from my days in the chemical plants. "It's industrial solvent. It'll burn through your lungs and then your armor." "Can you open the door?" Kendra demanded, covering her mouth with a dense cloth from her belt. "He severed the localized hardline. The electronic lock is dead." I scrambled to the rear egress hatch, slamming my fist against the manual release. It was jammed shut, magnetically sealed from the outside. The yellow gas was descending rapidly. My eyes were already beginning to water and burn. I looked around the chaotic engineering bay, my mind shifting into the frantic, hyper-focused state that humans are infamous for. Break the door. How do you break a blast door? My eyes landed on a massive, heavy-duty Caterpillar plasma battery sitting on the charging rig. It was meant to power the automated loading mechs. "Commander!" I shouted, my lungs starting to feel like they were inhaling broken glass. "I need you to throw that battery at the door." Kendra looked at the heavy steel cylinder, which weighed roughly 400 pounds. Without a word, she holstered her weapon, stepped forward, and hefted the battery off the rack with a grunt of exertion. The synthetic muscles in her suit whined in protest, but she hoisted it onto her shoulder. "When I say go, hurl it dead center." I grabbed a spool of raw copper wiring and my plasma torch. I jammed one end of the wire into the high-voltage capacitor on my workbench and rapidly stripped the other end. The gas was at our chests now. I was coughing violently, spots dancing in my vision. "Wyatt, your structural integrity is failing," Kendra noted, her alien eyes watching me stumble. "I'm fine," I wheezed, flipping the safety off my plasma torch. "Throw it!" With a roar that shook the bay, Kendra launched the massive battery. It flew across the room and slammed into the center of the heavy blast doors with a deafening crack, denting the thick steel. It hit the floor directly at the base of the door. I didn't hesitate. I threw the live, stripped copper wire directly onto the battery's casing and fired my plasma torch at the exposed terminal. "Brace!" I screamed, diving behind my reinforced steel workbench. Kendra dropped to one knee, crossing her arms over her newly welded chest plate. When the raw plasma hit the overloaded battery, the resulting explosion didn't just blow the doors off their hinges, it vaporized them. A shockwave of blue fire and molten steel ripped out into the corridor, sucking the toxic yellow gas out of the room in a violent pressure vacuum. I was thrown hard against the back wall, my ears ringing with a high-pitched whine. The taste of blood filled my mouth. I forced my eyes open. The smoke was clearing. Where the blast doors used to be, there was now a jagged, glowing hole. In the corridor beyond, I could hear the panicked shouts of corporate security contractors. Mitchell's men. Kendra stood up slowly from the rubble. The explosion had charred the paint off her armor, leaving her looking like a demon forged in a dying star. She looked back at me, wiping a streak of violet blood from her jaw. "You turned a civilian power cell into a localized thermobaric bomb in under 40 seconds, she said, her voice laced with something akin to awe. I spat a glob of blood onto the grating and leaned heavily on my spanner as I stood up. "I'm from Detroit, Commander. We improvise." A squad of 5 human mercenaries, wearing Rio Tinto tactical gear, rushed into the corridor, aiming their assault rifles at the smoke-filled breach. "Drop the weapons, Kendra!" One of them, a lieutenant named O'Connor, shouted. "It's over!" Kendra didn't even flinch. She stepped out of the smoke, a towering titan of grey muscle and scorched tungsten. "Humanity," she said loudly, her voice echoing down the metal corridor, "is a fascinating species. You are fragile. Your bones break. Your skin tears. But when backed into a corner, you possess a madness that the rest of the galaxy rightly fears." She reached down, grabbed the jagged remains of a steel support beam that had been blown out by our explosion, and hefted it like a javelin. "Let me show you," Kendra snarled, "what happens when you cross one of yours and all of mine." She hurled the steel beam with terrifying velocity. It impaled the wall inches from O'Connor's head, severing the main lighting conduit. The corridor plunged into emergency red strobe lights. Chaos erupted. Gunfire flashed in the red dark. I grabbed a discarded pulse rifle from the ground and racked the bolt. We weren't just fighting a defensive war against separatists anymore. We were fighting a corporate massacre. And I was going to make sure Mitchell paid for every single drop of blood spilled on this rock. The corridor was a chaotic strobe of crimson emergency lighting and the blinding blue-white flashes of pulse rifle fire. The Rio Tinto security contractors, mostly ex-military operators drawn from outfits like Academy and Triple Canopy back on Earth, were heavily armed, but they were accustomed to fighting poorly equipped insurgents. Not a 7-foot Vorani warlord and a pissed-off Detroit mechanic. I pressed my back against the cold steel of the bulkhead, the stolen pulse rifle heavy and awkward in my unarmored hands. A burst of tungsten rounds chewed into the wall just inches from my face, showering my shoulder in razor-sharp shrapnel. "Wyatt! Keep their heads down!" Kendra roared over the deafening cacophony. She didn't wait for my covering fire. Kendra charged directly into the choke point, moving with a terrifying, predatory speed that defied her immense size. The newly fused tungsten plate on her chest deflected 3 direct hits, the kinetic force staggering her, but she didn't stop. She crashed into their front line like a freight train hitting a stalled sedan. I leaned out, squeezing the trigger of the pulse rifle. I wasn't aiming for the mercenaries. I was aiming for the high-pressure coolant lines running along the ceiling directly above them. Crack, crack, hiss. My third shot punctured the primary manifold. A torrent of sub-zero liquid nitrogen blasted downward, instantly freezing the air and blinding the rear guard of the security detail. 2 of the contractors dropped their weapons, screaming as the supercooled gas flash-froze their tactical visors and the skin beneath. Kendra used the distraction to grab Lieutenant O'Connor by his Kevlar vest, lifting him entirely off the floor with one hand. She hurled him into his remaining squadmates like a human bowling ball. The sickening crunch of breaking armor and bones echoed through the hall. Silence fell, broken only by the hiss of the ruptured coolant pipe and the heavy, ragged breathing of the Vorani commander. "Clear," she grunted, rolling her shoulders to shake off the impact of the rounds she had taken. She looked back at me, her amber eyes glowing in the dim light. "Your tactical geometry is unorthodox, human, but effective." "It's just plumbing, Commander," I replied, stepping over the groaning bodies of the mercenaries. "Now let's figure out what Mitchell is actually doing." We bypassed the main elevators, which were undoubtedly rigged with automated sentry turrets, and took the maintenance shafts toward Sector 4. My lungs still burned from the chlorine trifluoride gas, and a jagged piece of shrapnel was lodged shallowly in my left thigh, but the adrenaline masked the pain. We reached a localized security substation on Level B. I jammed my multi-tool into the terminal's access port, bypassing the biometric lock with a brute force decryption algorithm I'd bought off a black market coder in Neo-Tokyo years ago. The screen flickered green. "Let's see what you're hiding, Mitchell," I muttered, pulling up the colony's encrypted manifest and comms logs. As I scanned the data, my blood ran cold. "Commander," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "The Separatists attacking us. They aren't Separatists." Kendra stepped closer, her massive frame casting a shadow over the console. "Read the data, Wyatt." "It's a false flag," I explained, pulling up a series of financial transactions routed through offshore Cayman's accounts. "Mitchell isn't abandoning the refinery because it's being overrun. He's paying a rival mercenary cartel to attack us. The shell impacts, the breached perimeter, it's entirely controlled." "To what end?" she demanded, her claws clicking against the metal desk. "Rio Tinto spent billions establishing the Kepler-1 86F infrastructure. Why destroy it?" "Because they hit a dry well," I said, pulling up the geological survey reports that had been hidden in a classified sub-folder. "The helium-3 reserves here are depleted. The colony is a massive financial failure. If Rio Tinto admits it, their stock tanks. But if a hostile force destroys the refinery, they can claim a total loss under their interstellar insurance policy with Lloyd's of London. It's an $80 billion payout." Kendra's breath hitched. "And the human civilian workers. My Vorani soldiers." "Acceptable casualties," I said, feeling a sickening knot in my stomach. "Collateral damage to make the attack look real. Mitchell was going to kill your command staff, silence any witnesses, let the fake separatists slaughter the workers, and then fly away on the extraction shuttle, a wealthy hero." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. I looked up at Kendra. Vorani didn't show emotion like humans did. They didn't cry or shout in grief. Instead, their skin flushed a dark, bruised purple, and the dermal ridges on their faces flared. It was the physical manifestation of absolute, unyielding rage. "He is in the orbital command center," she stated, her voice unnervingly calm. "He is waiting for his extraction." "It's on the roof," I said, grabbing a pair of high-explosive breaching charges from the security lockup. "He'll have his elite guard with him. Heavy mechs. It's a suicide mission to go through the front door." "Then we will not use the door." The roof of the Kepler 186F refinery was a sprawling expanse of reinforced concrete and communication spires, battered by the howling, ammonia-laced winds of the planet's upper atmosphere. Mitchell's private extraction shuttle, a sleek, heavily armored Gulfstream aerospace yacht, was prepped on the landing pad, its engines whining as they cycled up to launch temperature. Director Mitchell stood near the boarding ramp, clutching a reinforced hard case containing the decrypted data drives. He was flanked by two heavily armed PMC operators, but the real threat was the machine standing between them. It was a Raytheon Goliath siege mech, 12 feet of angular, carbon composite armor, armed with twin rotary plasma cannons, and driven by a human pilot wired directly into the chassis. It was the kind of hardware designed to level city blocks, not guard a single man. From our vantage point in the ventilation exhaust housing above the pad, I analyzed the perimeter. "The Goliath is shielded," I told Kendra, shouting over the roaring wind. "Your kinetic hand cannon will just bounce off its magnetic field. We have to bypass the shields to hurt it." "I will draw its fire," Kendra said, gripping her weapon. "I will tear the pilot from the cockpit with my bare hands if I must." "No." I grabbed her arm. It was like grabbing a steel cable, but I held on. "That thing fires 1,000-degree plasma bursts. Your armor is compromised. It'll cook you alive before you get within 20 feet. You need to let me handle the mech. You get Mitchell." Kendra looked at me, her eyes scanning my battered, grease-stained jumpsuit. "You are a mechanic, Wyatt, not a soldier. Not a—" "Exactly," I grinned, pulling a localized EMP grenade and a heavy hyperspanner from my belt. "And that thing isn't a monster. It's just a machine, and machines have design flaws. Before she could object, I kicked out the ventilation grate and slid down the slanted roof, hitting the concrete deck at a full sprint. "Hey, Mitchell!" I screamed at the top of my lungs. The director spun around, his slicked-back hair whipping in the wind. His eyes widened in genuine shock. "Wyatt? How in the hell are you still alive?" "Detroit Engineering, you corporate parasite!" I yelled. The Goliath mech whirred, its massive chassis swiveling to face me. The rotary cannons began to spool up with a high-pitched, deadly whine. I didn't run away. I charged straight at it. The human brain is a funny thing. When faced with a 12-foot death machine, every biological instinct screams at you to flee. But humans possess the unique, terrifying ability to override their own survival instincts out of sheer spite. The mech fired. A torrent of blue plasma scorched the concrete where I had been a fraction of a second before. I dove into a forward roll, ignoring the searing heat that blistered the side of my face. The Raytheon Goliath has a flaw. I had read the schematics back in the orbital shipyards. The magnetic shielding is impenetrable from a distance, but the shield generator itself requires massive heat dispersion. The primary thermal vents are located on the back of the knees, and the shielding has a microsecond refresh lag when kinetic objects breach the perimeter at low velocities. I slid between the mech's massive, stomping legs. The heat beneath the machine was suffocating. I jammed the EMP grenade directly into the exposed, spinning cooling fan on the back of its left knee joint and hit the manual detonator. Thump! The localized electromagnetic pulse discharged directly into the cooling system. The mech shrieked, the left leg locking up completely as the localized circuitry fried. "Get him off me!" the pilot's voice screamed over the external speakers. The mech tried to pivot, its right leg stepping backward to crush me. But I was already climbing. I grabbed the hydraulic piston on the crippled leg, hauling myself up its back like a mountaineer scaling a cliff. "Wyatt!" Mitchell shouted, drawing his sidearm. But Mitchell had forgotten about the warlord. From the darkness of the exhaust housing, Kendra descended. She didn't jump. She fell like a meteor. She landed directly on one of the PMC operators, crushing him instantly under 800 pounds of armored mass. The second operator raised his rifle, but Kendra backhanded him with enough force to shatter his helmet and snap his neck. Mitchell leveled his pistol at her and fired frantically. Sparks flew as the rounds pinged off her shoulders, but she walked through the gunfire like rain. She grabbed Mitchell by the throat, hoisting the terrified corporate director 3 feet into the air. Meanwhile, I had reached the upper chassis of the crippling mech. The pilot, realizing he couldn't shake me, reached up with a massive mechanical arm to swat me off like a fly. I didn't try to pierce the armor. I took my heavy hyperspanner and slammed it with every ounce of strength I had into the manual emergency release valve on the cockpit canopy, a safety feature required by federal interstellar law. The pressure seal blew. The armored canopy popped open, exposing the panicked pilot inside. I leveled my pulse rifle directly at his face. "Power it down," I gasped, my chest heaving, blood dripping from my nose. "Or I paint the console with you." The pilot looked at the barrel of my gun, then down at his ruined leg, and slowly raised his hands off the neural link controls. The massive machine powered down with a dying groan. I climbed down, my legs trembling so violently I almost collapsed when I hit the concrete. I limped over to where Kendra was holding Mitchell. The director was choking, his face turning a vibrant shade of purple as his feet kicked uselessly in the air. The hard case containing the damning evidence lay dropped at his feet. Commander, I panted, leaning heavily on my rifle. Don't kill him. Kendra looked at me, her eyes burning with lethal intent. He orchestrated the slaughter of my people and yours. He deserves no mercy. I'm not asking for mercy, I said, spitting blood onto the deck. I'm asking for justice. If you break his neck, Rio Tinto covers it up. They'll say he died a hero. But if we transmit this data to the Interstellar Trade Commission, to the families of every mercenary out there, we don't just kill the man. We kill the company. We take everything. Kendra stared at me for a long, heavy moment. Slowly, a terrifying, jagged smile spread across her alien features. She realized exactly what I was suggesting. Total financial and social annihilation, a uniquely human brand of warfare. You humans, she purred, dropping Mitchell roughly onto the concrete, where he gasped violently for air. You are truly the most vicious creatures in the cosmos. We try, I said, grabbing the hard case, as the sirens wailed in the distance, signaling the arrival of the actual planetary authorities. Kendra reached out and placed a massive hand on my shoulder. It was a gesture of profound respect in Vorani culture. You fixed my armor, human, she said, her deep voice carrying over the wind. And you broke their siege. When this is over, you will not return the Noto. I looked at the crippled siege mech, the terrified corporate executive, and the towering alien warlord standing beside me. I wiped the grease and blood from my forehead. I'll need a raise, I replied. Thank you so much for joining us on this wild sci-fi adventure. If you loved this HFY story of human grit, alien warlords, and epic corporate takedowns, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Don't forget to share this video with your fellow sci-fi fans and subscribe for more weekly tales where humanity proves we're the most dangerous force in the galaxy. Hit the bell icon so you never miss an upload. See you in the stars.